It's going to be all screwed up because we're missing Monday, so whatever. All right. On the front of your lab exercise book, anybody got one? Hold it up so they can see. On the front of your lab exercises book, you have a piece of bread with mold growing on it. And I showed you the posters, right? But I didn't show you the mold posters. That's what I didn't show you. I showed you all the posters except the mold posters, didn't I? Showed you the worm posters, the protein. Okay. We don't need no stinking mold posters. I can do without the mold posters. Okay. So I broke up kingdom fungi just into two general types, multicellular and unicellular. So first we're going to talk about the multicellular type. Okay. Here's my dad's lawn. He's a perfectionist. Neat freak. Every blade of grass has to be the same length. Did I mention that to you? No? I didn't say that. Okay. Then some dog comes along and takes a big old poo on your yard. You know? That's annoying. Somebody didn't scoop. Or even if they do scoop. Or even if a dog doesn't poo on your lawn. Let's just say the spore of a mushroom blows onto your grass, right? So, little mold mushroom spore lands in your grass, right? And you don't know it because it's dry and your lawn is perfect. But then it starts raining, you have a big rainstorm, and that little mushroom spore germinates and it starts making like roots, so to speak, into the soil, right? And you still don't see it while that's happening. But then one morning you get up and you walk out there and you're like, wow, look at that! And there's like this big old Basidio carp growing on your lawn. Smurf Village. Right? And underneath the cap of the mushroom are where all the spores are. So that when you pick the mushroom or go to remove the mushroom, or a squirrel comes along and eats the mushroom. Did you ever see squirrels eat mushrooms? Oh yeah, they love them. They'll go through your yard and pick that mushroom. You'll see them munching on the mushroom. The spores get knocked loose, and sure enough, they go airborne and they land on the neighbor's yard, right? Mushrooms aren't that hard to understand, right? You got it. You know how mushroom grows. When you go out in your yard and you see that mushroom growing, you know where it came from. There was a spore of a mushroom in the grass and it grew into a mushroom. Okay, same thing with the mold on your piece of bread. On the front of your lab book cover. Here's a nice moist piece of Wonder Bread, light and fluffy, raised with brewer's yeast. Lots of yeast farts, big empty bubbles in there, nice light fluffy Wonder Bread. So it's my turn to make lunches, so I take all the bread out of the big supersized loaf of bread and lay all my bread pieces out. And I got 2 slices for Al, and 2 for Tom, and 2 for Nan, and 2 for Mom. And this one wants bologna, and that one only eats peanut butter and jelly, and that one only eats salami, and Mom will eat anything. So I actually, took out 1 too many slices of bread. So I break the rule, and I commit the cardinal sin of putting the slice of bread back in the bread bag. And I wrap it up and stick it back in the cool, dark refrigerator. Well, while I was making my sandwiches, I had my kitchen window open. A nice little breeze blew in some mold spores, landed on my pieces of bread. So that piece of bread I put back in the bread bag is contaminated. That's why I shouldn't have put it back in the bread bag, but I did. And when it grows mold on it in the bread bag, it's going to contaminate the other slices of bread as well, so they're not going to be fresh anymore either. So, a few days go by, my turn to pack lunch again. Take out the loaf of bread, get out my slices of bread, and sure enough, there's a piece of bread with mold on it. If I scrape the mold off the bread, because I'm going to eat it anyway, I'm going to make somebody eat it anyway, I'll put that in Mom's lunch. That'll be my revenge for saying all these years,
Eat it anyway. It's a little penicillin. It's good for you. Just scrape it off. You'll be fine.
So when that spore landed on the piece of bread, let's say, and I put it back in the fridge cool and dark, that little spore germinates and grows a cell. And that cell grows another cell, and that cell grows another cell, and 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 another cell. And all this is growing into the bread. And I might take out my slice of bread before I even see the mold growing on it. It's growing in the bread. Just like before I ever see the mushroom, it's growing in the soil. It's establishing itself. Putting down like roots. Only we don't call them roots and molds, we call them mycelium. So each strand of cells is called a hypha. If I have many strands, the plural is hyphae, is plural. Just add an E on the end. And when I have so many that when I go to scrape my mold off the bread, a big clump comes out. It's like a long-haired cat, you know, they get those fur mats. So a mass of hyphae is mycelium. Okay, so one strand of cells is hypha, many strands is hyphae, many hyphae is a mycelium. And that's where you get your MYC prefix that refers to molds. So what if my patient has a dermatomycosis? What's he got?
Skin mold.
Mold on his skin. So he's got an osis, a condition of mold on the skin. So when you see the MYC prefix, that means a mold. Anybody ever heard of this antibiotic, streptomycin? Sure. It's made from streptomyces. Just like we get antibiotics from penicillin, we get antibiotics from streptomyces. The reason it's named streptomyces is because when they first discovered it, they thought it was a mold. Why? Because it grows in the soil in long chains of cells. It looks like mycelium. We later decided it's actually a filamentous bacterium, but that's beside the point. They thought it was a mold, so they named it streptomyces. Okay, good. Back to this. Once your mold spore has germinated and established itself in the bread, it's got a nice, good, healthy mycelium going there, then it decides it's time to start reproducing. So instead of sending cells down into the bread, now it's going to send a cell up off the surface of the bread. And that cell is going to differentiate into a reproductive structure. I just call it a fruiting body. And the fruiting body is going to have some kind of a cap on it. And that cap is going to produce spores. So all my little dots are spores. So it's a lot like a mushroom, only microscopic. Because you think there's just going to be one? No, there's going to be many in your mold, right? So when you have mold and you start to see the pigment, when you start to see the pigment in your mold, that's because it's producing reproductive structures and spores. Usually your mold is the darkest in the center. It's like maybe black, and then you see blue-green rings around it. Well, where you see the blue-green rings, the reproductive structures are coming up, and where you see the black, that's where the spores are being produced. And since the spore landed right here and grew out from there, the center is usually the most mature part of the mold, and that's why it's got the most spores, so it'll be the darkest black. And then it'll be lighter and lighter as you go out, because it's younger the farther you go out. So, now, when I take out this piece of bread, I'm gonna knock loose some of these spores, and where do you think they're gonna go? It's gonna blow out my window and my neighbor's window and land on her piece of bread. So that wasn't so hard, was it? Mushrooms, molds, it's pretty much the same thing, only molds are more microscopic than mushrooms. Okay? Okay, now let's talk about yeast. You already know from looking at the picture in your textbook on page 208 or whatever it was, I said it was, I don't even remember. But there was a picture of a budding yeast in your textbook. So you know Saccharomyces cells look a lot like this. Hey, look, we looked at Saccharomyces yeast cells and all we saw was a bunch of this. And then occasionally we'd see one bud off a new one, right? And the picture in your textbook even shows one with some budding scars where it had budded off other cells before. And eventually that cell now will just kind of go off and be on its own, right? And that's asexual reproduction in yeasts. They bud. Okay, now, let's specifically talk about Candida albicans. Candida albicans is also a yeast, only this yeast is not brewer's yeast. This yeast is human normal flora. Sometimes when our systems are out of balance because we've been taking an antibiotic or because we're immunocompromised, something like that, the Candida can overgrow. And then we have candidiasis. It's an overgrowth of normal flora. Specifically, the normal flora Candida albicans. We will refer to this as an opportunistic infection. We call many infections opportunistic. The point is, it takes advantage of the host when it's given the opportunity. What's the opportunity? Maybe it got where it shouldn't be. Maybe some of your bowel flora got into your peritoneal cavity because your bowel ruptured for some reason. Maybe you had an injury or a gunshot wound or something, a stab wound, and your bowel ruptured and some of the bowel bacteria got into your peritoneal cavity and you get an opportunistic infection. Maybe you have an incision and some of your skin flora got inside your body where it shouldn't be, and it causes an infection. It takes advantage of the opportunity because it's not normally granted that chance. But in the case of Candida, many times it will overgrow because it's given an opportunity because your system is out of balance, because you're immunocompromised or something like, or you're taking antibiotics or whatever. Okay, so that's what I mean by an opportunistic infection. Candida is a yeast, so it's a single-celled organism. I'm going to make my Candida pink. I'm going to make my Candida red because I don't have pink. Just so you don't mix them up with those. And Candida albicans, being a yeast, a unicellular fungus, will asexually replicate by budding. Not so unusual, very similar, right? Now, Candida does a peculiar thing sometimes. When it buds, instead of just budding off a new one and having it go off on its own, sometimes it will bud off a new one, and instead of it going off on its own, it sort of collapses down and stays attached. And then when this one buds, it collapses down and stays attached. And this one buds and collapses down. It might even go this way. And when it does that, we call it a pseudo-hypha, because it's not really a hypha the way molds do it, but kind of is. So we call it a pseudo-hypha. If you have many, many of them going on there, your Candida infection is going to have some oval vegetative cells, and it's going to have some of these chains of pseudohypha. And sometimes these chains of pseudohypha will even just bud off another regular oval cell. So if you have many pseudohypha, you can still call it pseudohyphae, it would still be plural. Okay? Okay. What?
What are they losing when they collapse?
What are they what?
What are they losing when they collapse?
I don't think they lose anything.
You mean just water? Or?
Oh. I kind of doubt they even lose much water. I think it's just a different form. Maybe they lose a little cytoplasm, water, maybe, I don't know, I never really asked.
Just kind of accepted it.
Okay, so, imagine oral thrush. Some poor little baby has oral thrush. There's a picture of it in your textbook, but I think the one in your textbook is an AIDS patient, and the oral thrush is actually occurring on the palate, on the top of the mouth. But in babies, a lot of times you'll see it like right on the tongue. In fact, I had a woman in my class, and she told me a story about her baby having oral thrush, and since she was breastfeeding, she got the opportunistic infection on her breast also. She said, wow, did that hurt? And this is why, because of the pseudohyphae. So the baby's got this white pasty stuff over his tongue. All right, here's baby's tongue. How's that? Cute tongue, right? And he's got this white pasty stuff all over his tongue. But even if I scraped all that white pasty stuff off, it would just grow right back, because penetrating his tongue are all those little strands of pseudohyphae. And so poor mom, after the kid's been sucking on her nipple, she gets white stuff on her nipple, but the tissue itself is penetrated by the pseudohyphae. Okay, now let's translate that to a vaginal yeast infection.
Nice.
Nice. Let's turn my piece of bread into a vagina here. Okay, we'll give her some hips. How's that? Okay.
I'm no expert, but I've never seen a vagina that looks like that.
She has a crooked vajayjay. Put it in the middle. You got a big one, huh? Long one. Give her a belly button. Okay. Poor thing. So she's got a vaginal yeast infection. It's a bad one. She's got white pasty stuff in there. Yuck. Okay. She can use Monistat cream, and it will kill off this stuff, right? And get rid of a lot of that stuff. But the pseudohyphae have penetrated the epithelial layers, because the vagina wall, it's thin tissue, and it's simple squamous epithelium lined. You remember from anatomy and physiology. And those cells are constantly sloughing off and constantly being renewed. Just like in your anus and your mouth and everywhere. Every orifice of your body has lining. And the purpose of that lining is to constantly renew itself, because it's an opening. Things going in, perhaps, things going out, whatever, and it needs to constantly renew. So it's thin